Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about why, when I've been asked which is better, because better is really a relative term, of what's better, bands versus chains, and why I would say if you were forced to pick between the two, if I could only have one of these things for a client, only have one of these things for someone watching my channel, why bands would be the way to go. Now, it's not only a training thing, but it's also a convenience thing. And they both have their place, and people need to understand I utilize both, and I utilize both very, very heavily for a reason. So, what's the difference in terms of why they're more convenient? Well, no one's going to pack around 100 plus pounds of chains. I've got 101 pounds of chains sitting on that bar right there in some of these, right? 101 pounds of chain. You're not carrying that in your gym bag. And if your gym doesn't already have chains there, you have no way to get them to a gym. And if they're in a commercial gym where people are using them, those chains are going to be set up different all the time. You're going to have to come back in and reset those chains up the way that you need for whatever specific percentages and numbers you're running. They are going to be more work to set up each time if other people have touched them. Now, in my case, I know all my chain sets, and I only have 2 different chain links that I run off of each loop, and they're easy to swap around. But bands, literally everybody can have bands. There is not a single one of you out there who can't conveniently bring your own bands to the gym and set them up. And I've done tutorial videos showing you how to use even just plates. If you have nothing more than a bunch of plates, a rack, basic benches, barbells, if you have only that, which if you don't have that stuff at a gym, that needs to be your biggest priority right now. You need to be looking for a way to get access to that stuff. But even people who have a home gym setup, if you just have enough plates and you got a nice rubber floor to train off of, rubber matting, you're good. Like, you can set up everything you need with bands. We can do max work, we can do speed work, everything else is just a band set. And it's the same thing for anyone taking them to the gym. There's a convenience factor. There's a convenience factor. But the difference in the training, because if you guys watch, I'm rotating through some of my different max lifts and my ramp ups to a max with both bands and chains, as well as some of my dynamic work from previous waves, mainly the heaviest days on each one, using both chains and bands. And people need to see that there is a difference between the two. Now, I've gotten to a point on those box squats where, ironically, I actually have hit the same max with bands and chains on the box squat. But in order to do that, you have to be extremely explosive at a lift to be able to pull that off. The majority of you are not going to be there, and you're sure not going to be there early on with any sort of speed training. So generally speaking, most people are not going to be able to do the same amount of weight against bands and chains for a 1 rep max, right? As far as the same band and chain tension. And it has to do with the fact of what bands do that are different. And there's pros and cons to that. What people need to look at is, what is it that chains do? Chains basically act like small plates. So in other words, they just replicate a gradual strength curve. When you set them up correctly, as each link is lifted off the floor, it adds weight on the way up so that you can program an exact amount of weight at the top and the bottom. For example, on those heavy ones where I have 100 pounds of chains, 101 pounds of chains, there's only a few pounds at the very bottom. We're talking about maybe 5 pounds. So those, when you saw me do the 432 off of the box squat, that's about 437 to 440 pounds at the bottom with 533 at the top, right? We can program exact numbers. And because there's no variation in the way the tension goes, it's just straight mechanical weight. When you are doing chains, they simply increase the weight as you go up an exact amount that you have complete control over, because chains are standardized. That's the beauty if we live in a country like America. Those chains are all standardized. If you buy given chains, there's regulations in place as far as their density and strength. And every company's chains will weigh the exact same weight per foot if they're the same size links, right? They're standardized. And we usually use 5-foot lengths of chain. That's what I use. That's what most chain sets are for lifting purposes. So you have very, very complete control. Like, literally, I know what each of those strands weigh. Out of those chains that are hanging on there now, some of them are exactly 12 pounds, and some of them are 17.1. 17.1. And you don't have to weigh those because they're standardized. There's an industry standard and laws and rules in place on their regulation. So if your chain is out of spec, technically the company that manufactured it could be fined. They could actually be fined for even producing a chain that doesn't weigh perfectly. So, easy, right? It's easy. Bands, on the other hand, totally different. The band does not just increase the weight linearly with the tension. In fact, some people are thinking, well, if you watch that band go up, that band doesn't gain extra tension in the last foot. It is already at pretty much peak tension. So you take those bands, and that is 100 pounds of band tension that I have on there with those black bands. It's 50 per side when they're stretched. So what ends up happening is those bands might have nothing at the bottom, and by the time you get to about midway up, they start kicking in really, really hard, and it is a very rapid curve. It's very rapid. So unlike the chains, it's just a gradual weight increase as you go up, right? If you have 100 pounds of chains, 50% of it, when you're halfway through the rep, you've got 50 pounds of chains added. Then it's 100 at the top, but the bands, it's not like that. That 100 pounds of bands turns into around 95 pounds about halfway into the rep. And then it only maybe adds a few pounds. So it turns from 95 to maybe 100 through the rest, the last foot of the lift, right? Well, the other thing that happens with bands is that when you start to lower the rep, like watch the speed work, when you start coming back down, they create an overspeed response. That band actually jerks you. And you guys can't see it because I'm strong enough to fight it. But if you're not used to band work, if you were to get under a squat bar right now like that with 100 pounds of bands pulled over the top and you go to lower the weight, the first time you do it, if you have never used bands and you're not a 500 pound squatter, you put 100 pounds like that on there, that band might jerk you. It might rip you all the way down to the box to where you hurt yourself. Okay. So I would say right now, if you're a 300 pound squatter and you go try to do something like that, and you try to squat onto a low box with 100 pounds of bands, the first time you do it with any weight, don't be surprised if it yanks you to the floor as soon as you break your knees and start lowering. It creates an overspeed effect. It has an eccentric focus. Bands create eccentric overloading because they store energy and then they jerk you. So you feel fine. You're like, oh man, this is a lot of tension. There's energy stored in the band. And then as soon as you start to lower, as soon as your joints unlock, the band tries to jerk you. And it will do the same thing when you slow. So what you have to learn to do is drive through. Like you watch those, it's like, man, that's a nice fast lockout. It has to be. So bands actually train you to pop through really fast at the top of a lift. Because if you go slow, again, 100 pounds of band tension, if you try to grind against 100 pounds of bands on a squat, you won't be able to grind. You're going to miss the rep. It's just going to jerk you flat. So what ends up happening with bands, the slower you try to go with bands, the more impossible they become. It actually starts to become almost impossible to complete a rep slowly against heavy band tension. Because what happens, the band rebounds. And as long as you're in the stretch and moving the band, it's stretching and stretching and stretching, and there's energy being applied. But the second you stop moving, it catches up, and the band tension creates like a peak, and it all of a sudden has more downforce. It pulls down harder. It pulls down harder. So the bands teach you to have to push through really hard because they create a very, very different rapid weight increase, and it happens very fast during like that last half of an exercise. And so they bring a lot to the table as far as that eccentric overloading. And again, when you're doing speed type work, again, it creates a much larger stretch reflex because they create a large eccentric overload. They can create an overspeed eccentric. And in general, they just try to pull you down. So you actually have to fight. Like on a max, when you go to lower the weight, you have to fight a little harder during part of the eccentric to control it. Then on the way back up, you have to explode harder. Now, people say, well, why wouldn't we just do bands for everything then? That sounds great. They are also harder to recover from. If you think about it in terms of eccentric overloading, and you think about those things, what do we know eccentric reps can do? They create extra micro tearing. They can create more DOMs. They can be harder to recover from. So what you find is that oftentimes when you're doing a lot of band work, you sometimes can't handle as much total training volume. They can negatively affect your ability to handle the volume. So there are reasons why we rotate through chains and bands. And plus the chains give you a lot of variation for things, max effort lifts. And the same thing on the speed work. We can rotate it through waves. And if a person doesn't have chains, I wouldn't have them do bands all the time. We would go to straight weight. We would just use straight weight. If you don't have the chains, and only do the bands for 3-week waves and then 3 weeks without bands. In a perfect world, you would have access to both, though, because it gives you a lot of training variation tools. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.